On a Friday morning in April of 2007, a rescue crewman was lowered from a helicopter onto the deck of a catamaran drifting alone in the Coral Sea, 88 nautical miles off the coast of Australia. The boat had been spotted 2 days earlier by a patrol aircraft moving strangely with no one at the wheel, its headsail shredded and flapping uselessly in the wind, and for 2 days the weather had been too rough to safely reach it. The rescue crewman, lowered alone onto a moving boat more than 100 miles from land, was deeply uneasy as his boots hit the deck. He had no backup, no idea what he would find, and when he saw knives scattered across the cabin floor, his first fear was that someone might still be aboard, hiding, dangerous. He searched the boat with his heart pounding, and what he found was, in its own way, far stranger than any threat he had imagined. The engine was idling, the electronics were still powered on, a laptop sat open below, there was food on the table, a half-finished cup of coffee, a newspaper from days before, fishing lines trailed in the water, a fishing rod was still mounted at the stern, the dinghy was still hoisted in place at the back of the boat, the anchor was up, the life jackets were all still aboard, the flares, the radio, everything present and in working order. Everything was exactly as it should be on a boat full of men enjoying the trip of a lifetime, except there were no men. All 3 of them gone. No bodies, no blood, no sign of a struggle, no distress call, nothing. 3 grown men on a 32-foot boat in the middle of an ordinary voyage, simply not there. Just an empty boat sailing itself across the ocean with the ghosts of an ordinary morning frozen in place all around. The press called it the ghost ship. They compared it to the Mary Celeste, the legendary merchant vessel found abandoned and adrift in the Atlantic more than a century earlier in 1872, her crew gone, her cargo intact, her last log entry days old. The cause, too, slotted instantly into that ancient and frightening tradition, the empty ship sailing on with no one aboard, as if the sea itself had simply reached up and plucked the people away. And for years, this has been told as one of the great unsolved mysteries of the sea. 3 men who simply vanished into thin air, a riddle with no answer. But here is the truth that almost nobody tells. It was solved. Not by a psychic, not by a conspiracy theory, but by patient, careful investigators who pieced together exactly what happened almost minute by minute from the evidence those 3 men left behind. And the real story, the true story, is in some ways far more haunting than any ghost. Because a ghost is something you can hold at a comfortable distance. A ghost is not going to happen to you. But what really happened on the CAS-2 could happen to almost anyone who has ever felt safe on a boat on a calm and beautiful day. Because it is not a story about the supernatural. It is a story about how 3 ordinary, happy men on a beautiful morning in calm spirits can be alive 1 second and gone the next because of a single, tiny, utterly human mistake. This is the real story of the catamaran called the CAS-2. Let's begin with the men, because they were not reckless adventurers and they were not fools. They were 3 retired friends from Perth on the other side of Australia, men who had known each other for years and decided to share an adventure. There was Derek Batten, 56 years old, the skipper and the owner of the boat. Everyone called him Des. He had been around boats for 25 years. He had taken a sailing course, he held a skipper certificate and a marine radio qualification, and his wife would later describe him as a careful, safety-conscious man. But there was a crucial gap in all that experience. Almost all of it was on motorboats. This catamaran was the first sailboat he had ever owned, and a sailing catamaran behaves in a completely different way from a motor cruiser. With him were 2 brothers, Peter and James Tunstead, 69 and 63 years old. The brothers had been around boats since they were young, but they had very little experience on a vessel like this one, and crucially, at least one of them could barely swim, if he could swim at all. So picture the crew honestly. 1 man who knew boats, but not this kind of boat, and 2 older men full of enthusiasm, but with thin experience, and, in the water, almost no chance of saving themselves. It was, on paper, a crew with just enough knowledge to feel confident and not quite enough to be safe.
the most dangerous combination there is at sea. The boat itself was a 32-foot sailing catamaran built back in 1980, and Des had bought it to make the journey of a lifetime.
The plan was ambitious and beautiful: to sail from Airlie Beach on Australia's east coast all the way around the top of the continent and down to Western Australia, a 2-month voyage of thousands of miles, home to Perth. This first leg was a short hop north, up the Queensland coast to the city of Townsville. And here is a detail that matters. The man who had sold Des the boat had specifically warned the crew not to push out beyond the sheltered waters near the coast because he did not think they had enough experience for the open sea. There had even been a false start. The day before they finally left, they had set out, then had to turn back to harbor because of a minor problem with the GPS, a small sign that they were still not fully familiar with their own boat. None of these were damning on their own. Plenty of people set off on a first big trip with thin experience and a few teething problems and come home with nothing but good memories. But the sea has a way of finding the gaps in your preparation and stacking small weaknesses, a little inexperience here, a habit not yet formed there, until together they become something deadly. But on the morning of Sunday, the 15th of April, the weather looked fine, light winds, and they set off in good spirits, full of excitement for the journey ahead. And then something extraordinary happened, something that would later give investigators a window directly into the final hour of these men's lives. One of them picked up a video camera. At 5 minutes past 10 that morning, James Tunstead filmed a short home video as the boat sailed near a place called George Point. And that footage is the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, because it shows us with perfect clarity exactly what was happening on board just minutes before everything went wrong. On the video, the mood is relaxed and happy. Des is at the wheel, a coffee mug in his hand, steering the boat along the coast. Peter is sitting right at the back of the boat on the low steps near the water, casually fishing with a line trailing behind them. The men are joking, teasing each other, enjoying a perfect morning on the water. But to an experienced sailor's eye, that same happy video is quietly full of warning signs. Not one of the 3 men is wearing a life jacket. The safety rail at the back of the boat, the barrier specifically designed to stop someone from falling overboard, is lowered, left down. The sky on the horizon looks a little threatening, and the sea has turned choppy, the conditions slowly starting to build. These were not careless men in their own minds. They simply felt completely safe, on their own boat, on a sunny morning, close to shore. It is a feeling every sailor knows, and it is exactly that feeling, that totally human sense of everyday safety, that the ocean is about to punish with terrible speed. And this is the thread that runs through almost every tragedy at sea, the gap between how safe a boat feels and how quickly it can turn, between the boat you think you understand and the way it actually behaves when something goes wrong. Learning to close that gap, to truly understand your boat and the real risks of the water before they ever find you, is exactly why I wrote the Bluewater Buyer's Manual. It is about knowing what you are really dealing with out there, so the ocean never catches you believing a comfortable lie. The full link is in the description below. Because shortly after that camera was switched off, in the space of just a few minutes, all 3 men would be in the water, and the boat would be sailing away from them, empty. So what actually happened? For years, the honest answer was that nobody could be completely certain. When the boat was first spotted, a massive search was launched, involving rescue helicopters, 9 aircraft, commercial vessels, and volunteer crews scouring thousands of square miles of ocean. A survival expert was consulted and concluded that by the time the boat was found, the men had almost certainly been in the water for days, with no realistic chance of survival. The families, desperate and helpless, even raised tens of thousands of dollars of their own money to keep searching, but the sea gave nothing back. No bodies were ever recovered. After a long investigation and a formal inquest in 2008 that heard from 27 witnesses and considered more than 100 pieces of evidence, the coroner, a man named Michael Barnes, was able to reconstruct the most likely sequence of events in careful, convincing detail. He was honest that he could not be absolutely definitive because no one survived to tell the tale. But the evidence pointed, with remarkable consistency, to one specific chain of events. And once you understand it, the mystery dissolves into something much sadder and much more real. The investigators had one more powerful tool, the boat's own GPS. The track it had recorded told its own silent story. For the first part of the morning, the boat held a steady, deliberate course up the coast, a boat being steered by a human hand. And then, at a certain point, that clean track dissolved into the aimless, wandering drift of a boat with no one at the wheel, turning with the wind and current instead of a helmsman. That moment, when purposeful steering became aimless drifting, marked almost exactly when the men were lost. And it lined up perfectly with everything else. It begins with that fishing line. When investigators examined the boat, they found the fishing lure, the hook at the end of the line, tangled around the rudder at the back of the left hull. The line that Peter had been trailing in the water had drifted back and snagged on the boat's own steering gear. And here, the small clues become almost defining. Investigators found that James had taken off his t-shirt and his glasses and set them down carefully on a seat. Think about what that means. You take off your glasses and your shirt and put them somewhere safe when you are about to do something physical, something where you might get wet or where you do not want to lose them. The most logical explanation, the coroner concluded, is this. One of the men, very likely James, leaned out over the back of the boat to free that tangled fishing lure from the rudder. And to do that, you have to lean right out over the low platform at the stern, the part sailors call the sugar scoop, the flat step that sits just above the water at the very back of the hull. With the safety rail down, with no life jacket, with the boat still moving and the sea now choppy, it would take almost nothing, a slip, a lurch of the boat, a momentary loss of balance, and he was in the water. Now the cascade begins, and it is merciless. The man is in the ocean, and the boat, still under sail, is already moving away from him. His brother, seeing him fall, does the most human thing imaginable. He does not stop to think. He does not reach for a life jacket or grab the life ring that was sitting right there. He jumps straight in after his brother to try to save him. And now there are two men in the water, both without flotation, and only one man left aboard. Des, the skipper, now faces the worst nightmare a sailor can imagine. Two of his friends are overboard, and the boat is sailing away from them. And here we find the detail that, more than any other, proves this was no supernatural event and no crime. When the boat was found, its engine was running, but it was idling in neutral. That single fact tells a story all by itself. Putting the engine into neutral is a deliberate human action. It is precisely what a skipper would do in a man-overboard emergency, taking the engine out of gear so that the spinning propellers cannot strike and injure the men now in the water behind the boat. That neutral gear is the fingerprint of Des reacting, exactly as a responsible skipper should to save his friends. But the boat was still under sail, still being driven forward by the wind. To turn back, Des had to get those sails down and under control. So he left the wheel and moved to deal with the sails. And the moment he left the helm, with no one steering, the catamaran's course wandered, the wind shifted across the sail, and the heavy boom, the great horizontal spar at the bottom of the mainsail, swung violently across the deck in an uncontrolled jibe. On a catamaran, this is especially treacherous, and it is worth understanding why, because it is central to the whole tragedy. A normal sailboat, a monohull, leans over when the wind pushes on its sails. That leaning is uncomfortable, but it is also a warning, a constant physical signal telling you exactly how much force is building in the rig. A catamaran does not do that. It sits flat and stable and calm, even as enormous force silently loads up in the sails and the rigging. For an inexperienced crew, that flatness feels wonderfully safe and reassuring, but it hides the truth, and it means that when something lets go, when that boom finally swings, it comes across the deck with shocking, sudden, sweeping power, with none of the warning a leaning monohull would have given. Des had spent 25 years on motorboats, where there is no boom, no mainsail, no sudden lethal sweep across the deck. This was the one danger his long experience had never taught him to expect. There is a haunting clue here, too. Dez's coffee mug was found near the boat's life ring, as if he had set it down and was reaching for that life ring to throw to his friends in the final seconds when the boom caught him. That boom would have swept the deck like a battering ram and knocked him clean off the boat, possibly knocking him senseless as he went into the sea. And now all three of them were in the water. In perhaps 30 seconds from one snagged fishing lure, the entire crew was overboard, and the boat, suddenly lighter and still pushed by its sails, simply sailed away from them. It would have been beyond their reach almost instantly, gliding off across the waves at the speed of a running man, far faster than any person could ever swim. 3 older men, fully clothed with no life jackets, in a building sea, watching their boat, their only refuge in thousands of square miles of ocean, sails steadily away and shrink toward the horizon. It is almost unbearable to imagine. The water cold, the waves lifting and dropping them, their clothes growing heavy, and the one thing that could save them gliding further away with every passing second, indifferent, driven by a wind that did not care. There was even a witness. The day after the men are believed to have gone overboard, the skipper of a commercial fishing boat saw a white yacht with a torn sail drifting sideways between the reefs, moving with the current. He came within 50 meters of it. He saw no one aboard, but it did not occur to him that anything was wrong, and he had a personal rule never to approach another vessel, so he sailed on, never knowing he may have been looking at the ghost ship 2 days before the world learned its name. The coroner's words on this were quiet and devastating. Once the 3 men were in the water, he wrote, there was very little chance they could get back on the boat, as it was blown along before the wind while they struggled in the lumpy seas. From that point, he said, the end would have been swift. There is a strange mercy buried in those words. Whatever happened, it did not happen slowly over days of drifting. It happened fast, in the space of a single terrible minute. 3 friends caught together in a chain of events none of them could stop. And that is the true story of the ghost ship. Not a riddle, not a curse, but a chain reaction of ordinary human moments. A tangled fishing line, a brother's instinct to help, a skipper's brave attempt to turn back, each link in the chain entirely understandable, and together fatal in less than a minute. Now, the mystery has endured for one main reason, the strange, eerie state of the boat when it was found. So let's walk through the things that made it seem so impossible, because each one has a real, grounded explanation. The food on the table, the open laptop, the coffee cup. These were not the remains of a meal abandoned mid-bite by men snatched away by some force. This was simply the ordinary clutter of a relaxed day on the water, exactly as the men had left it that morning while they were up on deck, sailing and fishing. The boat was found in a state of normal daytime life, because that is precisely when the accident happened, in the middle of an ordinary morning. And here is the deeper reason this story grips people so powerfully. It is genuinely hard for the human mind to accept that 3 lives can simply end in half a minute, while the coffee cup stays on the table, the laptop keeps playing, and the everyday objects of a happy morning sit perfectly undisturbed. The contrast feels wrong, almost impossible. We expect a tragedy that erases 3 people to also leave wreckage, chaos, some visible mark of the violence that took them. But the ocean does not work that way. It can erase the people in an instant by drowning and leave the boat and everything on it almost perfectly preserved. That gap between the vanished lives and the untouched things is exactly what makes a ghost ship feel supernatural, when it is really just the sea doing what the sea has always done. The knives found scattered on the cabin floor, which fueled so many dark theories, had simply been shaken loose and thrown about by 5 days of the boat pitching and rolling, unmanned, through the open sea. The torn headsail, the same thing, days of wind and uncontrolled motion ripping at a sail that no one was there to tend. And the most important clue of all, the thing that quietly closes the door on every sinister theory, nothing was taken. When investigators went through the boat, they found cameras, wallets, satellite communications gear, and even a rifle with 100 rounds of ammunition, all still aboard, all untouched. No pirate, no thief, no hijacker on Earth boards a boat, harms the crew, and then politely leaves behind the cash, the electronics, and the guns.
The forensic officer who examined the boat for hours put it simply. He did not believe a crime had been committed and concluded the boat itself was not a crime scene. There was no blood. There was no sign of any struggle. There was no sign that anyone other than those three men had ever been aboard. Of course, people have proposed other explanations over the years, and to be fair, we should look at them honestly.
Some suggested the boat had run aground on a sandbar and that the men climbed into the shallow water to push it free, only for a gust to blow it out of their grasp. It is a rational idea, but it stumbles on the evidence. If they had used the engine to power off a sandbank, it would most likely have been found in reverse, not idling in neutral. And it does not explain the carefully removed glasses and shirt, or that fishing lure wound tightly around the rudder. Others suspected piracy, or that the men had stumbled onto something they were not meant to see. But as we have said, the untouched rifle, the cash, the electronics, and the complete absence of any struggle make that impossible. And a few even wondered whether the men had faked their own disappearance, staged the whole thing to vanish from their lives. But the investigation found three men with stable families and stable finances, no debts driving them to flee, no motive at all. And besides, abandoning a boat in the middle of a reef where it might quickly be found and examined would be a senseless way to disappear. Every alternative theory, when you actually press on it, simply falls apart. There is one last loose thread, and honesty demands that we mention it, because it is the one piece that does not fit perfectly. A volunteer radio operator on shore recorded that the CAS-2 had radioed in that evening at 6:45, hours after investigators believed the men were already gone, reporting that all was well. For a long time, this was the great contradiction. How could they call in that evening if they vanished that morning? But the explanation is almost certainly more mundane than mysterious. Those volunteer radio logs were kept by hand, often by people juggling many calls at once, and the most likely answer is a simple human error, a mistaken time, a misheard boat name, another vessel entirely. Set against the hard physical evidence, the daytime clothing on deck, the lack of any dinner being prepared, the boat already drifting without a hand on the helm, that single radio note simply cannot outweigh everything else, and the coroner set it aside. So in the end, what are we left with? Not a ghost story. Something quieter, and in truth, something far more important. We are left with a lesson written in the lives of three good men that every single person who ever steps onto a boat should carry with them. Because here is the most painful part of this entire story. Almost all of it was preventable. The boat was well equipped. It had life jackets aboard for everyone. It had life rings. It had flares. It had a working radio. None of it was being worn, and none of it was reached in time, because everything happened too fast. And that is the heart of it. Safety equipment that is stowed neatly below or sitting unworn on a seat cannot save your life in an emergency that unfolds in 30 seconds. If those men had simply been wearing life jackets, that one habit alone would very likely have saved every one of them, keeping them afloat and alive long enough to find a way back or to be found. If even one of them had been wearing a small personal locator beacon, a device the size of a phone that signals your exact position to rescuers the moment you hit the water, the searchers would have known where they were within minutes instead of searching a vast empty ocean for days while the men were already beyond saving. The technology to save all three of them existed, was cheap, and in some cases was already on the boat. It just was not on their bodies. And if anyone leaning out over that stern to free a snagged line had been clipped to the boat with a simple safety harness, that first fall would have ended with a man dangling at the side of his own boat, not lost in its wake. This is why experienced sailors talk endlessly about wearing your life jacket, about clipping on, about keeping a beacon on your body and not in a drawer. Not because they are nervous, and not because the sea is always dangerous, but because they understand deep in their bones that the ocean gives you no warning and no second chance. The men of the CAS-2 were not careless people. They were careful, ordinary, decent men who simply felt safe on a beautiful morning doing something they had done 100 times before. And that is exactly what makes their story so important and so worth telling honestly. Because it was not a curse that took them. It was a tangled fishing line, a lowered safety rail, and 3 life jackets that stayed exactly where they were stowed. The ghost ship was never really a ghost story at all. It was a warning. And if hearing it told truthfully makes even one person reach for their life jacket and actually put it on before they leave the dock, then the memory of those 3 men does something that matters. It quietly keeps somebody else alive, somewhere, on some future, calm, and beautiful morning.
Fair winds to them, and to everyone who goes to sea, please wear the jacket, clip yourself on, and never let the calm of a beautiful morning convince you that the ocean has forgotten how quickly everything can change.